Hi everyone, it's Nathaniel. Today I'm going to talk about 6 books that I highly recommend based off of their style, their substance, or their significance in my life. I have a ton of books that come to mind that I tell people about, but most of them you've probably either read them in school or you've read them because of their popularity in the past or something like that. So let's get to it. So to start with, I wanted to talk about The House of Leaves. I had heard of this book before, but I didn't pick it up until the awesome Amelia Boone had recommended it on her Instagram channel. What was fascinating really about this book was how it nests its stories within this series of ideas. So it essentially it starts off with someone coming across this collection of writing, and this writing is about an investigation that it goes on with this house. And so as you're going through, there's all these different ways that the author is telling this story, and incorporates different media. It incorporates the way that the writing is literally put onto the paper. So sometimes it's in the margin, sometimes it's really through the footnotes, sometimes the writing goes in literal circles, physical circles on the page, and sometimes it trails off or something like that. And so that style, kind of like any other book that changes the way you think while you're reading it, like A Clockwork Orange, with the language it utilizes, it makes you have to think in a different way. Well, this one, the physical style of the book itself, makes you have to immerse yourself into the story. And it has that aspect of, as the house in the story becomes bigger and vaster, and they go into the basement or the subterranean world of it, you're also going into the subterranean aspect of this person's mind as they're telling this story through their investigation. So that one is one that I highly recommend because of just that physical style. The next book under the style category is an older classic called Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. Now, this is the only one I think in the group that has been made into either a play or a movie or something like that, and you can see a different representation. When I read it many years ago, what I loved about it and what brought me into reading E.L. Doctorow's other works is that he, in Ragtime, that story is done as if you're watching a play. And it's not done, it's not written in a way where it's just the dialogue on the page. It's how the story progresses from one person to the next. So you might have a character physically walking through a park and passes by another character, and then the story picks up from that character as they continue on with their life. And so it's very much like if you're in an audience watching a play, really has this flow. And I've seen Mandel with some of her books. I think The Glass Hotel probably does it the most, where it kind of picks up that fluidity that goes through each of the characters' lives, and is really fascinating, I think. And I have yet to find another example that does it quite as well as E.L. Doctorow did with Ragtime. So as far as the substance category goes, Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, again, you have sort of these leveling areas that you go beneath the surface, but it's really the ideas that he is bringing in of how consciousness works. And it's this taking it into a place where we have our physical world and we have our intellectual world, and the ability to split that aspect of ourselves. So within Hard-Boiled Wonderland, the character is, I don't remember what they're called, but they are able to take information into their brain and sort of code it or scramble it in a way that makes it more secure. and then they're able to release it out of their brain. And in doing so, they create these places where this information can go. And the place that the character goes is sort of this fantasy place where unicorns exist, and it's a walled-in, city that he ends up coming across this other woman. And it really has to do with that almost second self, that other realization, this notion of having this physical versus this intellectual aspect of our being that is wholly separate from one another. And I really liked how that content was related. For the Sparrow, I read the Sparrow. It was from a recommendation. I wanted a sci-fi, and I picked it up. And if you look into Mary Doria Russell's background, it adds into a little bit of some of the context of what is going on. In essence, the Sparrow is about a group of people. They discover sounds from another world and decide to get out on essentially a mission trip to meet the other locals and everything. And the Jesuit priest, who is a linguist, is attached to this mission. So he goes to this other world, and there's two beings, or two humanoid type characters that live on this place. One of them has got, sort of predatory aspects to him, and another one is more of kind of like, for lack of a better word, like cows, but they are very similar in their aspects, right? And you see this divergent evolution that goes along with it. And then through the course of learning the language, learning the culture, there's misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and ultimately they lead to tragedy and everything. And this priest, he comes to a place in his life that he questions the existence of God or his belief system because how badly everything ultimately goes. So we kind of come into the story with him being returned, and everyone else has died from the mission, and they're trying to find out what has gone on. But because of the trauma that he experienced, and some of he's had some body modifications that happened and everything, so he's in a really bad spiritual and emotional place as they're trying to rehabilitate him and bring him back in. And what is so fascinating to me about this book, and I have read it a couple of times, is that at its root, it is what reinforces our belief system. And because we have belief systems, especially when it comes to things like faith, that are fairly tenuous, and certain things can rock them, right? And so what happens with him is that it ultimately comes to this idea that he has been forsaken by his God. Of course, his belief in himself has been shaken. And so the reason why it's called the Sparrow is because of the passage out of the Bible talking about every sparrow is watched over by God. And he feels like he was lost, like he was forsaken by God, that he wasn't taken care of. And it goes back to, as we try to understand extremely complex things in our lives, we have this fallacy that we start with, that we know where we're going. Even if we acknowledge that we are at a loss, we don't know the full extent of that fallacy, right? And so he gets back, and the idea is that he was, ultimately being taken care of, but it was through his human nature that his misinterpretation, his misjudgment, and where he put his faith lied incorrectly. So I felt like it was an extremely good representation of that, and she built a world that is completely understandable and believable, and it continues to be one of my favorite sci-fi. It's not this hard science side, but as you'll see in later videos, I'll talk about language, and I really liked how it talked about the linguistics and how that helps create understanding. You know, when you're reading certain books, you remember where you read them, right? You remember where you picked them up, or you remember who recommended them to you, or what your motivation was in getting these books. And it's weird because as many books as I've read in my life, there's only a handful that I remember like significant details of events outside of the reading of that book. But because of the impact that these books had, I, have very distinct memories of certain events. Or for these two books, I remember where I got them. And each of these was over 30 years ago that I got these books. But I've revisited them through my life, and I've gained, even more appreciation of them. And the first one is Before Adam by Jack London. Now, Jack London, of course, is known for Call of the Wild, White Fang, and some of his other naturalist stories. And Before Adam it's another take on his naturalist ideas. But what he really goes into with Before Adam is that humanity has this collective consciousness, this sort of genetic lineage that has come from all the way back when primitive man was around. There's this one passage that I have to bring up, and it was where the narrator, who every time he sleeps, he's living a life as a primitive man, and one day he's visiting a traveling circus, and there's this tiger that's in one of those cages that they put on the rails and everything. And as he approaches it, this animal responds to him, and so they see each other in this form of themselves, right? And so that one always stuck with me. And interestingly enough, to me at least, that when I was reading that book, I was actually on a church mission trip. And this was back when I was a part of like the Southern Baptist, church organization. And we would go to different places. And at that time we were in Laredo, Texas, and we were helping a fairly young, small parish build an entryway for their church. And we had like a vacation Bible school for the local children and things like that. And here I'm reading this book that is really removing, doesn't really address the religious faith piece at all, right? And it's really just talking about humanity and its connection to the world at large, and how we have had this coevolution through our lives. Now, the world that I lived in was anti anything that suggested that we came from anything other than the Adam and Eve story. And so it really kind of opened my eyes at that time of what the possibilities that were out there. And I loved it for it. I absolutely loved that book because of it. The place that I got that book was a used bookstore, a dingy little place that actually is still around, and still you find great deals at. It's called the Pea Picker. It's in Tyler, Texas. If you ever have an opportunity to go there, it absolutely outdoes the franchise used bookstores, in my opinion. And it's a wonderful place. And I found tons of books from there, but Before Adam is the only one that stuck with me and that I remember. This last book is hands down my favorite book of all time. And it's not because it is as enjoyable as some other books. It's not because it's not current or anything like that. It was actually written in 1895, I believe. But it stayed with me in a way that no other book has, and I've read it many times over the last 35 years probably, and I've gotten different things out of it as I've read more and as I've learned more and as I've grown as a person and aged and all of that other stuff. And so I've seen different aspects of it as I read it. It's called Lilith by George MacDonald. And a little background, George MacDonald, he wrote a lot of children's books. The Princess and the Goblin series is what he was really well known for. And he has a lot of, religious background. I think that his father and maybe even he were preachers at some point or another. But he wanted to break into a little bit more of the adult fiction world. And so he wrote Lilith and Phantasmagoria and a couple other things that were really meant for an adult audience. Well, his writing actually influenced Tolkien and then ultimately C.S. Lewis. So some of the things in Lilith you actually will find in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So Lilith, in a nutshell, it's about a young man who has inherited an estate, and as he is lounging around the library reading a book, he sees the old librarian going into an unknown room, and then when he follows through, he comes across this giant mirror in the attic. He stumbles into this other world. Now, Lilith it's an allegory about this young man ultimately going to heaven. But in the course of it, he comes across this battle that has been raging for eternity, and we discover that the old librarian, who changes into a raven at times, is actually Adam. But in the course of his travels through this other world, he finds out that the Lilith is, according to Judeo-Christian mythology, she defied God and everything, and that's why she was cast out. And depending on different, versions, she also created the different demons or succubi and incubi and things like that. And in this one, they know that she can be redeemed. It's just a matter of her giving up this anger and everything. And I won't go too much into it, but there's a group of children who stay children, and they are pure. And the description of some of the children becoming adults is, in some ways, it's heartbreaking, because it's not just a matter of becoming an adult. It's by becoming a big person, you're losing focus, you're losing a sense of empathy, you're losing a sense of sympathy for your fellow people, and you kind of become dumb and you become blind and you don't see the world around you, whereas the little ones, the children, are eternally innocent and selfless and caring and everything. And there's a lot of other imagery in this story that I think is just phenomenal, and I have yet to find another one that goes along with this story, or in this style, this manner of developing, what it means to ultimately sort of give up that selfishness and that peace that holds on to what's not important. And I truly believe, like, even if you're not a religious person, you can respect or enjoy this story for what it is and how it describes the landscape and everything. As a fantasy, it's great. If you want to see it as a parable or an allegory, that's also great. And I just think that the storytelling is very easy to follow. Even in its Victorian style writing, it's an easy story to digest and take in. And so that concludes my 6 recommendations. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you have any comments or you have any suggestions, let me know in the comments, because I would love to hear how certain books have affected you or have stuck with you through the years. So other than that, have a great day. Bye.